Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're here to talk about a revolution. To help me do that, let me welcome up my panelists who are going to discuss the shale oil and gas revolution that's transforming the energy economy of North America and possibly the world. So please, I'll introduce them in turn as we get started. But it strikes me, having covered energy for many years at The Economist in the past, before heading off to China, my current post, for ages, people in the industry will remember that gas was always the ugly duckling, sort of lesser sibling of oil. The old saying used to be that you find gas once, you're forgiven, second time you're fired throughout history. And so we had the delusion of scarcity. And it was typically flared off if you found it in distant areas. And of course, now the economics have changed, not only because of technologies like LNG that have been developed, but the collision of markets, mind, money, that have ultimately produced the shale revolution here in North America. This promises extraordinary benefits. We've already seen the impact on price. We're seeing some knock-on implications on related industries, be that petrochemicals or manufacturing sectors that have heavy energy inputs. But what will be the implications going forward on perhaps other economies? What might be some of the challenges, environmental, regulatory? We've seen a lot of fierce opposition and even bans in some places in the world. So help us to dig into this, to understand the true implications of one of the most important factors transforming not just the energy economy, but the broader economy, the world of finance. I am very pleased to introduce Kathleen Eisbrenner, founder and chief executive of NextDecade, Marc Lipschultz, global head of energy and infrastructure at KKR, and James Tisch, president and chief executive of Loews Corporation. Please give them a round of applause for joining us. So I might start, and of course, as always, your questions will be very important. We have a Twitter feed as well that I'm monitoring, so we'll get to those in due course. But to give you something to challenge, let's see what our panelists think about this. You know, Marc, I might start with you. Can you tell us, when you look at the implications of today's shale gas, let's start with gas, and we'll get to shale oil in a moment. How significant a development is this when we look at the energy economy?
Sure, and Vijay, thank you for having us here today and for this really interesting conversation. You used the term revolution in introducing the panel, and I think indeed that is the right term of art. This is a revolutionary change in the energy landscape. And the implications are multifaceted and they are significant. So we've gone from a place here in North America where we thought gas was sort of just about out to a place where we now have gas in abundance. And that entirely transforms the energy policies that we can implement here in North America. And North America is probably not the only place where we're going to see some of the impacts of the shale revolution. But the implications are significant. We're talking about the ability, if really embraced, to create millions of new jobs. We're talking about the ability to transform our dependence on foreign oil. We're talking about a change in the environmental impact, a very positive change in the environmental impact and the use of natural gas in place of other fuels. An ability to actually really change in a very positive way, again, our trade deficit. So the impacts are really dramatic across the spectrum. Now that all assumes we get it right. It assumes we embrace this opportunity. But the opportunity is definitely here. This revolutionary change is here. And I think we can really change a lot of aspects of this country.
Well, let's tease out a couple of the pieces of that. When we look at, let's look at, for example, something our Buttonwood audience is certainly interested in, price. Which has been perhaps the most distinctive feature of the arrival of shale gas on the markets. Gas prices have collapsed, obviously, in North America. Can we see this as something that is going to kill coal and renewables, to put it bluntly? Does somebody want to take a view on the likely implications for the other rival sources? We've already seen coal's share. I mean, King Coal, some people argued as recently as 5 years ago that the 21st century would be a century of coal in America as well. For a long time, over 50% of our electricity mix did come from coal generation, and we've already seen that number drop sharply. Are we in the midst of seeing what Britain saw for different reasons a couple of decades ago, which was a dash to gas, where a predominantly coal grid transformed into a gas grid with all of the vulnerabilities that came with that too, but nevertheless, the economic change. Is that what we're seeing, where this will be the slayer of coal in America?
Very possibly. In the past year, gas took an enormous amounts of market share from coal, and gas is just very cheap. The reason gas is cheap is because, as Mark said, it's in abundance here in the United States. It went from, in '08, gas traded at $15 per MCF. It traded down to $2, and now it's trading under $4 an MCF, which converted to BTU basis for oil is about $22 a barrel. So gas is trading at about 25% of the cost of oil. And my guess is that we can produce enormous amounts of gas. We could produce 1/3 or half more than we're currently producing at a cost of somewhere between $4 and $4.50 an MCF, which translates into less than $30 a barrel of oil. So we have an enormous resource base, and that's going to be very difficult competition for coal when it comes to generation of electricity.
How about renewables? Does someone want to take up that piece of the puzzle? Are we seeing, in effect, natural gas, which has been posited as a clean energy fuel? It is clean burning, though we'll talk a little bit about leakage of methane, for example, in the supply chain when we get to that. But it has been placed, certainly considered by environmentalists when you talk about nuclear or coal for baseload. Gas had been favored until recently.
So
could this be the green future that wipes out solar, wind, and other so-called new renewables?
So my understanding is that renewables, primarily solar and wind, have their place because it's been mandated by legislation. And so that will continue. If you look purely on the basis of economics, most of what I've seen says that the renewables industry is not a viable industry without either the mandates or the tax credits that come with it.
Kathleen, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I'd like to suggest, I think of natural gas as natural gas being the fuel of the foreseeable future. We're going to need renewables at some point in time, but probably not in my lifetime. When you go and you tour the Eagle Ford or the Utica, some of these shale plays, it's amazing to see, and maybe I can try to create a picture for you. What's happened over the last 5 to 10 years is entrepreneurs in the U.S., not the big oil companies, entrepreneurs have gone out and they've gathered acreage potential. And you go and you look, and the way I visualize it, the way these shale plays are worked, they basically build what they call a pad site for drilling rigs. To me, it's like a gravel football field. But you go and look at these, and you see basically one completed well on each one, which is built for 6. So we've pretty much, completed the land acquisition in different places around the U.S. for both natural gas and shale oil. But I think we have 6 times the productivity capability than we're actually seeing today. So I think these entrepreneurs will continue to get better and better at reducing cost. But the marginal cost of continuing to develop, it's like, I think in effect, we've built a bunch of strategic storage here in the U.S., and we probably have 200 years worth of gas.
Well, that's an extraordinary amount of resources. And the resource base was never much in question. It was always a question of, can it be economic with prevailing prices, with prevailing technology? I think that's where innovation coming from an unexpected quarter. It wasn't the majors, of course, that brought us unconventional gas, particularly shale. It was risk-taking independence, a bit of serendipity. Some people would argue a bit of government push early on, although the industry tends not to put much stock in that, but there was early money from Department of Energy funding Mitchell and some of the other companies in this space. But nevertheless, it wasn't the traditional path of big oil getting us to this place. It was a messier mix of forces that brought us. And what I'm hearing, at least from this panel, is that this will be short-term bad news for both coal and renewables, though I think, Kathleen, you're holding out the hope that one distant day, renewables may yet come with gas as the bridge to that kind of future. I've often heard that from the renewables community. It's like in Brazil, it's often been said it's the country of tomorrow, and it always will be. So let's see what happens with renewables. Maybe there'll be some folks in the audience who'll push back on that. Let's talk a little bit about the implications for other sectors of the economy, because of course, energy is an input into so much else. It's a master resource, as it's been called. What are the sectors that are most likely to be affected directly by an era of dramatically lower foreseeable prices and input prices? Petrochemicals obviously comes to mind. Refineries, we can see the front page of the New York Times business section, quite an extensive story about the revival in marginal refineries because of these inputs. Can you help us talk through what are both the winners and losers, perhaps, from in other parts of the economy?
So two winners will be, number one, as you said, petrochemicals, plastics, industries that use natural gas liquids, because along with natural gas comes natural gas liquids. So we've seen a tremendous increase in natural gas liquids production. Prices have come down dramatically for propane and ethane, which are the two main building blocks. And so we're seeing tremendous interest in building billion-dollar ethane crackers down in Louisiana and Texas, which is really the hub for that industry. The other big industry that will benefit, I think, is the transportation industry. And I think it will start with the large 18-wheeler trucks that will convert from operating on diesel fuel to operating on LNG. And that could mean a savings per truck each year of $25,000 in operating costs. It costs today about $75,000 to make that transition from diesel to natural gas. So with a 3-year payback on the investment, I think over the next decade, you're going to see a wholesale shift in how these trucks are powered. And, that represents about 15 or 20% of the oil that's consumed here in the United States. So it's
so you see an opportunity for fuel substitution, as it were, switching away from oil, be that used as gasoline or as diesel, towards something derived from natural gas.
And it's going to happen.
Source.
It's going to happen because one trucker is going to do it, and then all the others are going to have to follow, simply because otherwise their product will be priced too high to survive in the marketplace.
Does anyone want to challenge that view on the idea of not that shale gas is here or might be used in traditional uses, but that it will substitute for petroleum?
No, I'd echo the view, and in fact, I think building on that insight, think about the significance of that statement in terms of, again, back to the opening question, why does this all matter? If we talk about that type of substitution and the impact on imports of oil, it's a complete change in geopolitical positions of the various, the Middle East relative to North America. And so I actually think that there's lots of incentives, economic and national security alike, that would suggest that direction is a pretty encouraging, exciting, and real direction. The petrochemicals observations, so additional ethane production or ethylene production down in the Gulf Coast, significant billions of dollars being contemplated by people like Dow. But how about the fact that we're talking about Shell building such a facility in Pennsylvania? I mean, that's a really amazing statement when we think about just 5 years ago. We were busy building infrastructure in this country to import natural gas. Right? That infrastructure, as constructed, is no longer useful. Now, there's some interesting things we can do with it, and I'm sure we'll come on to that conversation. But the implications for reindustrialization of North America are dramatic, and I think Jim's absolutely right on the two most immediate sectors where we could see large-scale adoption and a large-scale impact on the economy.
Kathleen?
One of the reasons why the shale revolution has taken off as dramatically as it has is because we were fortunate here in the U.S. to have a very developed natural gas grid, both from a wholesale basis as well as a retail
Outside
basis.
maybe bits of New England, I think we have one of the most extensive natural gas grids in the world.
Exactly. And I think the challenge to the transfer of diesel fuel to LNG is one of logistics. There doesn't exist today a backbone of fueling stations for this to happen, but it's under development now. And if you think about the fact that once the hubs for these fueling stations are in place along the corridors from Houston to LA and LA to Colorado and on, the overall implications, not just for the trucking industry, but also for the our homeowner vehicles, the incremental cost to be able to offer CNG, if in fact you've built an LNG facility, is $100,000 for a facility to be able to supply thousands of cars.
The view that we're going to see a substitution in transportation by natural gas enabled by the low-cost shale is one that's challenged. And of all the arguments that have been put on the table thus far, I think though all three of you are clearly supporters of that idea, I think a note of skepticism is in order for those that don't follow the energy industry closely. Many a fuel has tried to supplant gasoline as the transport fuel. I mean, the old saying in the industry, and I'm full of these canards, is the best substitute for gasoline is gasoline, right? We've tried over the years, not only with CNG, but hydrogen, with electricity, and it is a very robust incumbent with extraordinary fueling infrastructure, rapid refueling, familiarity with extensive support from incumbents. So this will not be easy to do, right? Even if the points you've made are to be taken at face value in terms of retrofit costs and the economics and ubiquity of this new fuel. And also, there's an implicit assumption that prices will stay low. And one thing we know from the history of energy and fossil fuels particularly is prices can be volatile. There can be bottlenecks. Even in the history of nuclear energy, it was said this is going to be so cheap that you won't even need to meter it. At a time of early enthusiasm and arrival of a new technology, this could be a similar moment in shale. Who knows? Yeah, so I would just inject a slight note of caution about whether we're going to be able to get off of oil by going on to natural gas quite so easily.
I would argue that it's happened already. If you look at
where has it happened?
In the United States. If you look at gas,
what proportion of vehicles?
So here's the point. Yeah. If you look at gas consumption, it's been steadily going up for the past 5 and 10 years.
Just to be clear, you're talking about gasoline or natural gas?
Natural gas.
Natural gas. Just to be clear.
So if you look at natural gas consumption, it's been steadily going up.
Sure.
Oil consumption peaked in 2007, and it's down.
But that's not necessarily because of fuel substitution, the point we're discussing. A colleague of ours at The Economist wrote a very provocative piece, I thought very thoughtful piece, on how rich countries have reached not peak oil, but peak car. Even in the US, we're seeing the long-term trend in adding more and more cars per household actually peaking. And that may be due to a separate factor than natural gas on the rise in transportation. Isn't it true?
It's possible, but oil powers more than just automobiles. And it's just interesting to me that oil consumption is down. I ascribe it more to the price per BTU and the invisible hand of the market doing its work. And gas is so cheap and oil is so expensive. It's now, as I said, a ratio of 4 to 1 more expensive. In the past few years, it was much as 6 and 7 to 1. And so as a result, you're just seeing that on the margin, people that are consuming oil are moving away from it, and they're moving to natural gas.
But Vijay, yeah. I think we can probably all agree that of the things we've so far described in terms of uses of natural gas, the transformation of the transportation sector will be the most challenging because it requires the most extensive new build infrastructure,
right.
And it requires a change in consumer behavior. And so if we take it from trucks even into consumer vehicles. So it'll definitely be the hardest. But it's amazing what economics will do, which I think at Jim's in the heart of Jim's point is
Sure.
there's an awful lot of economic incentive to do it, and it goes beyond economic incentive, as I said. And there is evidence. So I think to your earlier question, do we think it'll happen? Here, I think we can point to tangible evidence. How about fleet vehicles today? Go out and get on a bus here in New York, it's going to be a natural gas-powered bus. So, and that's true in a lot of large municipalities today. So actually, this notion of the kind of wall surrounding transportation with gasoline, it has actually already been breached. We have buses and other kind of fleet vehicles where refueling can be done in a centralized way, already making that substitution. So we actually have seen natural gas enter the transportation sector. Can we now have it promulgate itself through the transportation sector? That's going to require a good, sound policy around the development of the natural gas resource. Because for people to want to invest in all those trucks, they have to make sure they're going to actually have access to the resource long term. And we're going to have the right kinds of policies in place to get that infrastructure built. Well, there's a chicken and an egg involved, right?
You mentioned policies, and that gets to an important area we haven't talked about much, and that is, do we have the policy framework in place to deal with the environmental concerns, which of course are quite serious and raised around the world when it comes to shale gas, particularly. We've talked mostly about gas. We can talk about oil in a moment. In France, of course, it's banned, parts of the US as well, because of concerns about local environmental pollution, water use, but also because of methane emissions, perhaps through the supply chain. Can we talk a little bit about what we need to see in terms of the right kind of framework to make sure that this industry goes forward in a responsible manner? I see the potential. Go ahead, Jim, you're about to say.
No, I was going to say that, first of all, the natural gas industry is an enormous industry. And every industrial process comes with some sort of risks. Every industrial process that there is. I would say that in view of how large the gas industry is, that when you think about it, it actually has a very good record of providing a commodity at an attractive price where the damage that it's done has been actually rather minimal. That I understand there is concern about fracking. I understand that it's an emotional issue dealing with people concerned about their water supply. But when you think about it, we've been doing fracking for 60 years now. And when done properly, there is virtually no risk to fracking. And likewise, we move the equivalent of 10 million barrels of oil a day through our natural gas pipelines. And we produce that 10 or 11 million barrels a day here. And again, there's very minimal risk that comes with that. So I think that so far the record has been very good. And I think the level of regulation that we have is reasonable in view of the risks I see as well as the record that the industry has put together.
Now, you make the point, fracking is nothing new, right? And that history books show that, as do the technology textbooks. But you also chose your words carefully. You said, when done properly. Part of the challenge provided by environmental groups or activists is that it's not always done properly, and there's not enough requirement for disclosure on data, vital data, to ensure what are emissions, what is the supply chain, methane emissions, for example, what are local water emissions, that even if there are virtuous rules on the books, there is not enough transparency or data to assure that it's being done properly. Is there a fair point there that we might need to do more in terms of disclosure by companies so that they can be kept honest, to be sure, to give reassurance to communities that they are actually doing things the right way?
My understanding is that contents of fracking fluids are fully disclosed. They're available on the internet. So yes, there is full disclosure of that. I think what you're talking about beyond regulation, because I think we all agree that generally the regulations are there, you're talking about inspection.
Yes.
And in my mind, that's actually a rather minor item. Easy to implement. All it requires is state and federal governments increasing the level of inspections depending upon their perceived need for them. But yes.
I think there's some communities in the Gulf that would say it's easy to talk about, not always done in practice, given historical coziness between the energy industry and regulators. Surely you'd give a little bit more ground that this needs to be, it's not as easy to do as you say.
Well, I think the industry has been very proactive. So it hasn't necessarily been done by mandate, but more by offering up the fracking fluid combinations and that type of thing. So I think the industry has been working cooperatively, with the regulators, as opposed to having there always should be, I suppose, a sense of a bit of positive tension. But I think the increase in the importance of shale to the U.S. natural gas business has also created another level of innovation, which is in fracking techniques and fracking fluids. So increasingly, it's things like salt or sugar or natural products rather than chemicals, that are being used. And so I think again, it's capital markets that are at work, and the entrepreneurs are looking to do this safer because that increases their mandate to be able to stay in business, and they're looking to do it less expensively because that increases their bottom line. Well,
you mentioned capital markets. I'm going to turn to the audience in just a moment. If you can get the house lights up, and people, if you can get your questions ready for our panelists. I want to stick with the idea of markets for a moment and put a question to our panelists. As big believers in markets, as we all are here at the Buttonwood Gathering, would you all support opening up to international trade U.S. shale so that it's exported?
Yes, I do.
You do?
Strongly so.
And would markets functioning lead to higher prices for Americans? Would you stand up and defend higher natural gas prices for Americans?
Americans will not see significantly higher natural gas prices as a result of the exportation of natural gas.
Well done.
We have to remember that for the past 50, 60, 70 years, gas was a scarce commodity. Only in the past 3, 4, or 5 years do we fully understand how abundant natural gas is. We have more than 100 years supply. We have producers that are ready to jump in and drill wells the second natural gas prices on the commodity exchange gets to $4 or $4.25 an MCF. We currently produce 65 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. And my strong guess is that we could produce another 1/3 or 50% without the price of natural gas going up more than 25 or 50 cents an MCF. For every additional billion cubic feet of natural gas a day that we produce, my number is that we'll create an additional 7,000 to 10,000 jobs. Daniel Yergin, yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, was talking about an additional 40,000 jobs. So, and as Mark talked about at the beginning, it will make an enormous difference in our trade deficit and our current account deficit. So,
all these are good things, but how is it possible that we can meet, for example, huge demand from China, where there's a massive interest in importing gas, with no impact on price at all?
Number one, we have a very flat supply curve. So landowners or E&P companies are ready to drill as soon as the price gets to a level that's economic for them. And like I said, that's in a small range between $4 and $4.50 an MCF. So the productive capacity is there and will come into being when it's needed.
Okay. Well, let's see.
And Jim didn't say no impact. He said a modest impact.
All right.
I think the reality is, but I think the reality is we can always carve up protectionist policies that we think will artificially suppress the price of a product. I can make bread cheaper in this country if we simply refuse to export wheat, but not for very long. Eventually, the markets don't function. We don't get the thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs we can get out of creating this whole new industry. So I don't think protectionism somehow uniquely applied to natural gas is going to lead to a very optimal result. And by the way, we're a country that borrows a lot of money from China. So the fact that they like to buy some of this product we can produce, that's good news, not bad news.
All right.
And two more points. Just
Wait, hold on to that. You made your point forcefully. You even stood up and made it. So let's, in the time I have left, let's get some questions from the floor. I see a gentleman there. Just the usual ground rules. Please identify yourself and a short and sweet question, please. No gas bag interventions.
James May. We've got pretty good at cleaning up oil messes. When a fracking mistake happens, how will you clean it up?
All right, Jim?
It's such a wide open question. There have been claims that fracking fluid was discharged into rivers in Pennsylvania. But number one, it's not an endless supply of fracking fluid similar to what you saw with Macondo. Number two, it's the type of thing that very often will be diluted simply because of the vast amounts of water in these rivers compared to the amount of fracking fluid. Without talking about a specific example, though, it's sort of difficult for me to respond to how the industry would react and what it would do.
All right, so when the next accident happens, you can send him an email. He'll tell you how he would do it. I see there's the microphone is there, sir. Identify yourself, please.
Ronnie Chan from Hong Kong. Forgive the ignorance of this Chinaman. Is it correct to say that the process to build out the conversion may be environmentally sensitive, but once it is converted, that the long-term impact on the environment is better, then should we short the likes of Exxon, or should we double up? Should we short Israel in the Middle East because of possible American retreat somewhat from that part of the world as we become more more energy self-dependent? How long will it take for America to really become self-dependent?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it addresses perhaps one of the core aspects of this issue, which we're in violent agreement about, that our balance of trade worldwide would be better if we exported natural gas. The beauty of shale is that each well costs something between $3 to $6 million to build. It's why it's the entrepreneurs that go out and drill, not the big oil companies, because that's just not meaningful enough for them. When you get to the process of conversion, as you say, and exports, it becomes much more costly. So it's easily in the billions of dollars of investment, and most of the plants that are on the drawing boards right now are actually double-digit billions. It also takes 4 to 4.5 years to build one of these facilities, and that's after a process of a couple years of going through the regulatory process. So there is, I think, shared on the panel, a great ambition for the future for exports, but we have to get at it now because it does take time and it does take capital.
How about the gentleman's mischievous question about U.S. foreign policy? Do we believe that unconventional resources writ large, not just shale gas, but the associated suite of gas and technologies, oil and technologies that are in North America, can lead to quote-unquote energy independence? That would mean that no more misguided wars in the Middle East, I think is the implication of the question.
So there's no doubt that as we become more energy independent on a BTU basis, that our reliance on the Middle East will decline significantly. And so yes, over the next 10 to 20 years, I think you can see a dramatic geopolitical shift in terms of where the focus of United States foreign policy is, resulting from our becoming more energy independent.
I would argue that to the gentleman's question that the U.S. still has many other strategic interests in the Middle East. So it won't be quite so easy to disentangle the U.S. presence, not least the influence of certain lobbies in Washington. But the idea of returning to an age when the U.S. was an energy superpower is an interesting one. Back in the early part of the 20th century, the U.S. was the Saudi Arabia of the world, exporting enormous amounts of oil. So maybe we'll see a return to that. Well, let's come here first, and then we'll go to the back row. Sir.
Thank you. Bal Das. I think that was an excellent point you made. I think the conventional wisdom that we will, when we become energy independent, disentangle from that region baffles me. Facts baffles me, but setting that aside, I'd be curious about the view of the panel in terms of the timing of our capacity to export. There are compelling reasons to export. But in terms of the timing, should we spend a little bit more time in enabling the reindustrialization and the remanufacturing basis, whether it's in the chemical industry and other industry here, before we get to the point that we start to feed the vast needs of Japan, China, and like Japan, some of our other allies? Thank you.
So one point I was going to make before that I'll make right now, thank you very much, is that the United States has an enormous competitive advantage right now because our natural gas is so much lower than natural gas in other places. We are not going to export that advantage. And the reason is because, number one, it's very expensive to transport natural gas, on the order of $3 to $5 per MCF. So no matter what, if we export natural gas to China, we are not going to export it at $4. It's going to need to be priced more like $8. So that's a benefit to us. Also, remember, we have virtually unlimited amounts of natural gas. I don't see any of us sitting here and debating whether or not we should be exporting coal. Yet we've exported coal for decades and decades without a lot of debate. And we do that because we as a nation understand that we have enormous amounts of spare capacity of coal. Well, I submit to you that our resource base in natural gas is very similar to our resource base in coal. So what it takes is for us to forget the old mindset that we had and remember that because of horizontal drilling, because of hydrofracking, the game has completely changed with respect to natural gas.
Well, and let's keep in mind the price of natural gas elsewhere in the world today. So today in Europe, natural gas is $9, $10. In Japan and elsewhere in Asia, it's as high as $15. So we're talking about an enormous gap, an enormous competitive advantage that American industry has in tapping this resource.
No, but if we were to see this world of interlinked gas markets, which is what would happen if the U.S. were to export and LNG were to take off dramatically, liquefied natural gas, we would presumably see a leveling of prices, with transportation costs being the differential. And so Asia, for example, would see ultimately lower LNG prices. It would become more competitive on gas, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but remember one other thing. My guess is that it's not that the United States is blessed with all of these different shale regions, the Eagle Ford, the Barnett, the Marcellus, the Utica. My guess is that other places around the globe have a similar resource base. They've just been dramatically slower to develop it for a whole host of reasons. But I would think that in the next 10 to 20 years, you will see the shale revolution in the United States move to other countries in the world. So,
well, actually, Kathleen, you've put a lot of your expertise into this. Can we poke at that a little bit? I mean, the broad principle you say certainly seems right, Jim, that what's happened here can happen elsewhere, that technology is developed here. Indeed, even the very companies that are developing expertise here could go elsewhere and help develop other markets. But isn't it true that if you go to other areas, the geologies are not as easy to work with as in the U.S.? Even some of the laws on in China, for example, geology is a state secret. You know, we don't have the same kind of secure land rights or property rights. So it won't be as easy anywhere in the world as it is in North America, will it?
I really don't think it'll be as easy. It will develop, and I think shale gas will become the new stranded gas, which will feed the international LNG market. But I think there's an insatiable demand ultimately for natural gas around the world.
What's the most promising market outside of North America where you think this could happen next, even with the difficulties?
Probably China. But if you look at Europe and most places in Asia, there's just fundamental differences. For example, the mineral rights are not owned by the landowners as they are here in the US. That creates an enormous incentive for ranchers or others to lease their property that just fundamentally doesn't exist. So it's a different capital kind of equation. And then I mentioned earlier, I think the fact that we have a robust, developed natural gas grid is an enormous competitive advantage. China's building one, but they're still building their backbone. You know, they haven't built, you know, the retail aspects that we have. So to create a little bit of controversy.
So we may end up with this technology becoming like GMOs, genetic modification, one where many parts of the world, U.S. in the lead, pursues a promising technology with risks, environmental and otherwise, and Europe decides to opt out, which is currently the moment in France. A quick question and a quick answer.
Sure. My name's Rob Eiler. I'm an economist, and I run an MBA program. And so one thing I thought about when you said about entrepreneurism in this market is, what's the optimal reaction of those that have made investments in new renewable energy as a result of this revolution?
Could you explain that a little
Sure.
more?
In other words, if I was an entrepreneur in the wind and solar space, how should I optimally react to this potentially stripping me of incentives to continue in that market?
Stripping of the
Incentives.
Incentives to remain in that market.
So-
if you're a green entrepreneur, should you get out?
Or should you stay in and potentially move more toward substituted energy in another renewable?
Well, so we see what's happened already. I think the wind energy credits are ending this year. And so we've seen this mad dash to build windmills this year, and there's nothing on the order books, or very little on the order books, for next year in the United States. I would submit that that's the wind market and the solar market is a market that's driven more by government incentives than it is by competition from natural gas. So as a renewables entrepreneur, you're focusing much more on what's going on in Washington rather than what's going on in the Marcellus
So you don't
Shale.
see natural gas prices as the dominant factor influencing renewables, clearly. That's what you just
Yes,
said.
correct.
Anyone disagree with that view? Anybody think that the low natural gas price will be the killer for wind and solar, to put it bluntly?
No, but I think it has clearly made the economics of renewables that much more challenging as a standalone matter. So if the future vision for renewables is a economically competitive resource, clearly we have repriced the market for energy.
The bar has moved in terms of making that
The
happen.
other thing is
Right.
you need natural gas generation capacity of electricity because sometimes the wind doesn't blow, sometimes the sun doesn't shine, and people don't want their electricity going off.
Right. All right. Well, with that very fossil fuel-y finish, we come to the end of our first panel. I hope you'll agree that our experts have injected great enthusiasm as well as energy into our morning, if you'll pardon the pun. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.